I want to be precise about what I saw, because imprecision is how legends get made out of events that were actually very small and very cold. I saw a woman shot twice in the chest at close range on the Rue des Écorcheurs. I watched her fall. I watched the masked men gather around her in that particular way. That means no witnesses, no complications, just a body that needs to disappear before dawn. I started moving toward her, because that is what you do when you see a person on the ground. You move toward them. It is not bravery. It is the most ordinary reflex a human being has, and it cost me 7 years of certainty about the world my father had built. She was wearing an orange shift that had been expensive once. Long ago, before the grime and the bare feet and the weeks or months or however long she had been running. She had no shoes. The pavement of the Rue des Écorcheurs was cold enough in the deep hours that I could see my own breath, and she lay on that pavement, with 2 slugs in her, and she was not breathing, and the blood was spreading under her back in the particular dark pattern that tells you a thing is over. And then she healed. Not slowly, not the way a bruise fades over days. She healed the way water fills a crack. Completely, and from within, and with a kind of inevitability that made the event feel more like physics than miracle. The wounds closed. Her chest began to move. She opened her eyes, which were the color of something very old. Not ancient in the way stones are ancient, but ancient in the way a frequency is ancient. Something that existed before the concepts we use to describe it. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I want to tell you that the years of cargo work, and the mandatory service year, and the 2 tours on the Ilion run had given me a baseline of composure that held even in the face of the physically impossible. That would be flattering and mostly false. Actually happened is that I stood very still, and all of the available processing in my nervous system went to one very simple verification loop. What I had seen, and whether I had actually seen it. I had actually seen it. The masked men saw me about 4 seconds into that verification loop. They had animal heads, a stag, a crow, something that might once have been a heron, not costumes, not theater. The masks were sealed, integrated, joined at the collar with a precision that spoke of manufacture rather than craft. And the eyes behind the lenses did not move in the way human eyes move when they are alarmed. They moved in the way targeting systems move. Acquiring, they fired at me. 2 rounds, close grouped, about 40 centimeters to my left because I had already started moving before the conscious decision to move had fully formed. The body knows things before the mind approves them, and my body had decided approximately 2 seconds before my mind caught up that the situation had entered a specific category with a specific protocol. Leave immediately, bearing and speed to be determined by available geometry. I went left, down the narrow cut beside the dry goods warehouse, which had a gate that I knew from the Ilion run was locked only by an internal bar that could be cleared by a specific angle of impact because I had cleared it before, twice, when the schedule was running tight, and the freight door on the main approach was backed up with a container dispute. The gate yielded. I was through. The woman on the ground, the woman who had just sealed her own chest wounds, the way you close a drawer, was swept up by the stag-masked one and carried without ceremony into the black car that had been idling 20 meters down the street. I heard the car accelerate. I ran until the sound of the engine faded, and then kept running for another 2 blocks, because the adrenaline had not yet received the message that the immediate problem was resolved. Stopped in a doorway on the and stood there, breathing until my hands stopped shaking, which took longer than I would have preferred. Then I stood there for another few minutes, while the breathing normalized, and I thought about the only fact I had confirmed in the last 4 minutes with certainty. My father's crest had been on the lapel of the stag-mask's coat. His name was Georges Radamonte. He was 61 years old, and he owned 3 refineries, a logistics consortium that operated across 9 planetary transit corridors, and an island property off the southern coast that he had purchased from a territorial authority whose name I had never been told and had stopped asking about when I was 16. He was my father. I had eaten dinner with him 9 days prior, and he had asked me about my work on the cargo manifests for the Ilion transit. And I had told him the run was showing a 12% deviation in the secondary hold allocation. And he had nodded and refilled my glass. and said nothing else of consequence for the rest of the evening. He had never once mentioned that he kept a woman who could not be killed. I did not go home. I went to the compound on the Isle Radamonte, the private island in the same basin, the one the family had held since before I was born, the one my father called his office and his associates called the facility, and that I had thought of, as a child, simply as the place we went in summer when the refineries were running well and he had time. The gates were high iron, worked with the family device. The grounds were lit with flat-spectrum lighting that spoke of a security system monitoring, in bandwidths the human eye does not naturally reach. I stood outside for 2 hours in the cold and thought. What I thought about was not sentiment. I had made peace, early, with the kind of man my father was. Not a bad man in the way that melodrama requires its fathers to be bad. Not cruel in the personal sense, but possessed of a specific moral topology in which certain categories of consideration simply did not register. He thought about the species the way a good engineer thinks about a bridge. Systemically, with genuine care for the outcome, and very little for the individual bolts. I had always known this. What I had not known was what he was building. I went to see him the next morning. His office was the ground floor of the compound's main house. A room full of things that had been expensive for so long they had stopped looking expensive, and had begun to look merely correct. Old wood, old instruments, the kind of art that was chosen for what it signified rather than what it showed. He was behind the desk when I came in. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, which was with an assessment that began at the face and worked inward, cataloging discrepancies between the last reading and the current one. He did not seem surprised. I told him what I had seen. I told him about the orange shift and the bare feet and the bullets and the healing. And I told him about the crest on the stag mask's lapel. And I told him all of this without inflection because I had decided before I came in that the way to get information from my father was not to demand it or perform anger at him, but to present him with the fact of my knowledge and let him calculate the most efficient response. He was a good calculator. Given the right inputs, he would give me what he thought I could handle. He was quiet for a time. He looked at the window. Outside the window was the compound garden, which was immaculate in the way that things maintained by other people's labor tend to be immaculate. He watched it for a time and then he looked back at me. He said, "She is an orphan, a ward of this house. She has a blood condition, a mutation, a coagulation mechanism that is unlike anything in the current literature. Something that operates on a level below what our instruments were designed to detect. She heals from damage that would be terminal in a standard pattern human. She is," he said. And for a moment something that was almost wonder crossed his face before the calculation reasserted itself. Very valuable. I asked him who the men in the masks were. He said they were associates. Colleagues from the medical consortium he had been funding for the last 12 years. The masks were a precaution. The girl had been kept, for her own protection and the integrity of the research, from seeing unmodified human faces, so that she could not draw comparisons that would be premature and potentially destabilizing. This the way a man says something he has practiced saying until he believes it. Asked him, "Destabilizing to whom?" He looked at me. I asked, "Who are you hiding her from?" He said, "There are others who know about her condition, who would use it badly. We are," he said, and the word was careful, protective. I asked him who was protecting her from the associates. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Pierre, there are things I have been building for a long time that you do not have the context to evaluate correctly. We learn from this girl will matter to everyone, to all of us, to the species." He said the species, the way a man says the company, with the particular flatness that means he is the one who decides what that word covers and what it doesn't, and whose interests it serves when the two come apart. Without pressing him further, because I was not yet sure what I was confronting, and I needed to see her again to know. Getting into the compound's intersection required a credential I did not have, a social occasion I had not been invited to, and a patience that I worked at assembling over the following 3 days, while I mapped what I could see of the facility's operation from the outside and the accessible corridors. The inner laboratory was on the building's east side. I could not reach it through the front of the building. The freight infrastructure was another question. The compound had a maintenance skeleton, freight corridors, utility passages, the accumulation of a building that had been renovated many times over 3 generations by contractors who cared about the surface more than the structure. I had explored those corridors as a child, in the summers when my father was working, and I had the grounds to myself, and the maintenance staff had decided I was the owner's son, and therefore their problem to tolerate, rather than anyone else's problem to manage. The body remembers what it was given at 14. On the 4th day after my meeting with my father, his invitation arrived. A salon, he called it. Private gathering of patrons and interested parties. An evening at the compound. The invitation was written in his hand, which was unusual. He had staff for correspondence, and writing it himself was a message about the nature of the occasion and my role in it. I understood the invitation for what it was. A test of whether I would behave. An offer to be brought inside the information, on his terms, at his pace, in the manner that left him in control of how much I understood and when. I attended. I wore the right coat. I shook the right hands. The assembled guests numbered perhaps 30, and they were wealthy and the wealthy, that specific kind of wealth looks when it has been applied for years to the project of not looking wealthy. Understated clothes, careful voices, the patient attention of people who have already decided they will get what they want and are merely waiting for the appropriate time to collect it. My father moved through them with the ease of a man who has been at the center of something for so long that the center feels like his natural location. In the middle of the salon, before the projection screen, a woman in a white dress stood up from her chair, walked to the center of the room, and cut her own throat with a blade she had produced from inside her sleeve. She did not do it desperately. She did it the way you open a door. The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of a congregation that has heard the text before and is now attending the delivery. The projection screen behind the woman showed her face, lit from within by a process I could not identify. Not photographic, not holographic, something that made the image pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat slowing. She fell. The blood spread on the pale tile in a shape that was more than biology, that had the quality of an intentional mark. The guests watched. They attended. I was standing to the left of the room, and I was looking at the woman on the floor and at the guests watching her, and at my father at the far end who was watching me. And in the 3 or 4 seconds of that tableau, I understood a number of things simultaneously that I had been trying not to understand for the previous 4 days. That this was a suicide cult and not a medical consortium. That the people in this room believed in something with the quality of belief that does not require evidence, because it has replaced the function that evidence serves. And that whatever my father told himself about the science and the species, the practice had acquired a life of its own, that operated beyond the science, the species, and the clean, theoretical justification he had given me across his expensive desk. And then the girl in the orange shift was there. She came in from the side corridor, barefoot, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of someone who has learned to navigate a space without being seen. Not trying to be unseen, not performing invisibility, but simply having arrived at the efficient solution to the problem of moving through a space full of hostile attention, which is to move in the patterns the hostile attention is not oriented to detect. She knelt beside the woman on the floor. She drank, not frantically. The same quality the woman in the white dress had shown in the act that had put her on the floor. Matter of fact, as if completing a necessary step in a sequence that had a logic she understood, and that the logic required her to complete. The woman on the floor, after a time, began to breathe again. I had moved without realizing I was moving. I was 3 meters from the girl when I stopped myself. She had looked up at me. She had been looking at me since before I stopped. I realized, tracking me from the moment I stood, with the same comprehensive attention she gave to everything in the room, but calibrated differently for me, as if I were a variable she had not encountered before and was currently classifying. Her eyes were not brown or green. They were the color of a frequency. Something that occupied a register adjacent to visible light. Looking into them was like standing at the edge of something that extended downward, without a visible bottom. Not threatening, not beckoning, simply, very deep and still, and old in the way that a signal is old when it has been traveling for a long time. She did not speak. She would never speak, in all the time I knew her in that year. Not from inability, not from damage, but from a discipline so deeply embedded it had become structural, the way a river's course becomes structural after long enough. She communicated in other ways that I learned to read only partially, and my father had spent 12 years not learning to read at all. My face appeared on the projection screen. The room turned. My father looked at me from across it, not angry, measuring, calculating which intervention would produce the least deviation from the preferred outcome. Her hand. I do not know why. No, that is imprecise, and I promised myself precision. I know exactly why. She was barefoot on cold tile. There were men in animal masks at the perimeter of the room. She was the only person present who had no apparent choice about being there. Those are three conditions that, taken together, in a certain kind of person, produce a very simple response. The response is not a decision. It is more like the load-bearing junction in a freight corridor. A point where the available paths converge into one. We ran. We did not make it far. The compound's security was better than the rotation I had mapped, because the rotation I had mapped was the one they wanted me to see. And the actual rotation included a secondary layer that operated on a different cycle. We were stopped in the East Corridor by 3 of the associates, mask, and 2 I had not seen before. One with a great reddish-brown mask that might have been a fox, and one with a smooth white one that had no animal I could identify. They had weapons. They directed us back. My father did not raise his voice when we were brought to the formal room. He ran across from me and was quiet for a time, and then he said, "Pierre, you are making this harder than it needs to be." And he said it without accusation, without anger, without the particular parental register that uses disappointment as a weapon. He said it with the pure operational fatigue of someone whose model has been complicated by an unexpected variable and who is now recalculating at cost. I told him I wanted to understand what she was. He said she was a prototype, that the mutation, he called it a mutation carefully, as if the word were a door he was keeping ajar, was not unique to her. There had been others earlier, less stable. They had not survived the conditions required to study them. She was the most stable and the most reproducible in the qualities that mattered. The healing factor, the blood composition, the specific cascade of biological processes that his consortium had been trying for 12 years to isolate and transfer. What lived in her blood was a kind of future, he said, and the question was simply who controlled the application of that future. I asked him, "Does she want to be here?" He was quiet for a long time, longer than the question warranted. If the answer were straightforwardly no, or straightforwardly yes, or even complicated. The length of the silence told me more than the words that followed, which were, "That is not a question with relevant operational status." I said nothing. I had learned something precise and important about my father in that moment. Not about his cruelty, which I had always known was present in him, the way a river is present below the level of daily awareness, feeding everything and accountable for nothing, but about his specific blind spot. He could not see her as a person who wanted things. The category was not available to him in the context of the research. She was a compound, a condition, a resource with properties. What she wanted was not data, it was noise. I was placed under a soft form of house arrest within the compound. Not restrained, not caged, but watched. My movements were logged. The associates tracked me in rotation. The girl was moved deeper into the facility, to the inner laboratory I had not yet reached. I spent 3 days being careful and observed and compliant, eating the meals that the compound kitchen produced and reading from the compound's library and mapping. Carefully, everything I could determine about the freight infrastructure from what I could reach and what I could remember from the summers at 14. On the 4th day, the Grandmaster came. He was tall, in a white cape that was not theatrical, not a costume, not an affectation, but a functional garment, sealed at the throat and flowing to the ankle in a way that spoke of a very old design tradition that had arrived at the Cape through a different route than human tailoring. Shh. He moved in it the way a surgeon moves in a coat, with the economical authority of someone whose clothing has always been a tool. He came with others, 12 of them, in dark, close-fitting clothes, faces uncovered. moving through the estate grounds in the gray morning with a precision that was not military, but was adjacent to military, the way that a very old practice is adjacent to everything it preceded. They were not human. Or they had been human once, in the way that a river has been rain. The basic architecture was present. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head placed at the top and oriented forward, hands with fingers capable of the fine work that distinguishes the species. What lived inside that architecture had completed a process that most members of the species were still in the very early stages of. You could see it in the way they moved. Not faster or stronger, nothing so crude, but more resolved, as if each motion had been arrived at through a shorter deliberation than the same motion takes in a standard pattern person. Efficient in the way that a very long practice makes things efficient. Not by eliminating the work, but by making the work feel like not work. I did not know this yet. I learned it later from what the Grandmaster explained, and I spent a long time afterward deciding how much of it to believe, and which parts I believed for the right reasons. What I could see, that morning, was that they moved through my father's armed associates, the way water moves through a broken thing, not destroying it. Finding this of least resistance, and there were more of those paths than my father had ever calculated, because my father had built his security around the assumption that any threat would come from things that shared his basic topology of values. I used the commotion. I had spent 3 days learning the freight corridor. The east approach from the intersection to the laboratory ran through a junction I had last used at 14, and the junction was where I needed it to be. The lock on the laboratory door was a current generation system, not mechanical, not crackable by force, but dependent on a power relay that ran through the freight infrastructure at the junction point. The relay cycled its load balancers on a 60-second rhythm that I had sat beside for 40 minutes at 14 years old while eating a sandwich the cook had packed for me that summer, watching the maintenance crew work. And the rhythm had not changed, because maintenance rhythms do not change when the people who set them no longer work there, and the people who inherited the system do not know. The system is doing anything that matters. The magnetic tool from the maintenance cabinet 12 meters back. The cabinet had not been moved. The tool was the same model, or close enough to the same model that the function was identical. 60 seconds of darkness in the lock system. The door opened. She was inside, seated on the edge of the examination table in the center of the room. Not restrained, not sedated sitting, in the orange shift that was the only garment she had ever appeared in. Her bare feet on the cold floor, and her hands folded in her lap, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is the most efficient available response to a great many situations. When I came through the door, she looked at me with the complete attention she had turned on me in the salon, which was the attention of someone confirming an expectation rather than registering a surprise. I said, "We are leaving. I do not know how much of that you understand." She stood up. There is no ambiguity in someone standing up in response to the word leaving, whatever else she was. Whatever the frequency in her eyes, and the blood that closed bullet wounds, and the patience she had built over however many years of being held in this facility. She understood the word, and she agreed with what it meant, and she expressed that agreement in the most economical way available. She walked to the door. She waited for me to lead. We went through the freight corridor. Behind us, I could hear the estate coming apart at its security seams, weapons fire, running steps, the flat particular reports of small arms, and then the different quality of silence that follows when the people firing discover that what they are firing at does not respond to being shot in the way their training and their experience have led them to expect it to respond. That silence is one of the most useful sounds I know. It means the opposition is pausing to recalibrate. Pauses are intervals. Intervals have uses. I had the magnetic tool. I had a cargo worker's wrench I had taken from the maintenance cabinet. Old pattern, 40 centimeters. The kind of tool that has been used for so long that its grip has taken the impression of every hand that held it before yours. The weight distribution is perfect on an old wrench of that type, because the alloy has been refined through decades of feedback from the people doing the work. And the people doing the work are always smarter about the tool than the people who designed it. I had used one like it for 2 years on the Ilion run before my father had promoted me to manifest supervision, and I had kept the habit of carrying one in my belt, even when the work did not strictly require it. Because on the Ilion run, you learn early that the work always eventually requires it. We came out of the freight corridor into the east yard, and there were 2 associates between us and the gate, Heron Mask and the white smooth one. They had weapons leveled and they told me to stop. I did not stop. What I want to say about the next 30 seconds, and have been precise about in my own accounting of it since, is this. There is a quality of certainty that is not bravado. It is not recklessness. It is not the absence of fear, which was present in the standard quantities and performing its standard physiological functions. It is the presence of a calculation that has been completed and verified and checked against available data and has produced a clear answer. The calculation in this case was, these 2 men have a mission that requires them to contain us, and I have a wrench and 35 years of working with my hands in spaces where the work is physical and the margin for error is structural, and the girl behind me has been shot twice in the chest and healed before my eyes. And one of those facts is more operationally useful in this specific configuration than the others. And the arithmetic therefore has a direction. I hit Heron Mask in the inside of the elbow before he could complete his grip, which collapses the weapon hand in a very specific and temporary but sufficient way. This is not something I learned from a manual. Learned it from Sergeant Instructor Voss in the mandatory service year I did at 19, which my father had called a wasted year, and which I had considered the most efficiently educational year of my life. Partly for the techniques Voss taught and partly for the principle behind all of them, which was the body of a human being, in close quarters, with the right information about where force meets structure, is a tool of considerable precision. The weapon dropped. The white smooth one aimed at me. I was already moving, and the girl was beside me, and she put her hand on the white smooth one's forearm, gently, the way you stop a child from reaching for something hot, with a certainty that the child will understand and comply. Shh. He stopped. Not frozen. Not compelled in any visible mechanical sense. He stopped the way you stop when something reorganizes the equation you were operating from. He stood there, with the weapon raised, and then he lowered it, and his shoulders dropped, and he stepped to the side, and the path was open. I did not ask her about it. We were moving. We went through the gate, and the Grand Master was on the eye, waiting, in his white cape in the gray, early morning, with 3 of his people flanking him at a distance that suggested both readiness and a deliberate absence of threat display. He looked at me with the particular attention of someone who has been watching a variable they were uncertain about and is now updating their model. He said, "You are Radamante's son." I said, "I was." He considered that. Then he said, "She trusts you." I said, "I don't know what she does. I know what I did." He nodded, which was the response of someone who has heard an important distinction drawn correctly and is marking it. He said, "Come with us." And there was no compulsion in it, no pressure, only the flat offer of a direction and sufficient room around it to choose something else. The thing about people who are very far along a certain kind of development is that they tend not to need to compel. Compelling is inefficient. It is the tactic of someone who cannot afford to let the other party's choice be free. We went with them. They had vehicles in the lane outside the compound's east wall. Clean, unremarkable, the kind of transport that does its work by not asking to be looked at. We drove northeast for 4 hours through country that became progressively less interested in being country with an owner and more interested in simply being land. Open, old, with the particular quality of ground that has been farmed and abandoned, and farmed again enough times that it has arrived at a kind of patient neutrality. The house was at the end of a track through a standoff that had not been managed for decades, and were therefore enormous and various and deeply indifferent to everything below them. The house itself had been a theater once. You could see it in the architecture, the high ceiling of the main room, the proportions that spoke of an audience once arrayed in a specific direction, the ghost of a stage at the far end behind a heavy velvet curtain that had been red. Originally, before time and dust had moved it toward a color that had no common name. The Grand Master and his people moved through it with the comfortable authority of occupation, not ownership but presence. The quality of people who have been somewhere long enough that the place has adjusted to them. They gave me food and a chair and time, which were the right things. They gave the girl a dry cloth to wrap around herself and a place to sit by the wall where her back was to stone. And her sightlines covered the room, which were the other right things, and she sat with the wrap around her shoulders and her feet tucked under her, and watch everything in the room that was not anxiety and was not vigilance in the defensive sense, but was simply the baseline state of someone who has learned that attention is the primary tool. The Grandmaster explained what they were. He was not evasive about it, and he was not grandiose. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has said something many times and has refined it down to what is actually true, removing the parts that were in the original account because they were rhetorically useful, and keeping only what the experience actually justified. It took a long time. The version I can compress into something that holds its shape is this. They were ahead, not of the current generation only, or of the current century. Ahead of the current stage, the way a river is ahead of the particular limestone it has not yet finished cutting through. The change was not a mutation in the clinical sense. It was a direction that the species had been moving in for longer than my father's institutions existed. And the change expressed itself differently in different individuals at different rates. But it was not random, and it was not reversible, and it was not available to be extracted from the people who carried it and applied to the people who didn't. It did not work that way. My father had spent 12 years discovering that it did not work that way. The blood was not the thing. The blood was evidence of the thing. What my father wanted was a shortcut to a destination that was only reachable by making the journey, and the journey was not optional. I asked him what happened to the people who tried to extract the shortcut. He said, "They spend a great deal of time, and they learn a great deal about the properties of what they are studying, and they never reproduce the result they are looking for. And eventually the weight of that failure either opens them up to understanding what they were actually looking at, or it breaks them into ideology," he said. My father had not yet reached the either-or, and that was not a permanent condition. I thought about my father in his compound, about the salon and the woman in the white dress, who had cut her own throat with the patience of someone completing a familiar task, about 30 people watching and attending as if at a liturgy that they had come to love for reasons they no longer needed to examine, about 12 years of blood taken from a girl who could not or would not say what she wanted, and the man taking it to himself it was for the species, and the word species is doing the same work that words always do when we use them to replace the faces of the people the decision actually affects. I said, "There are more associates, full security complement. He will regroup." The Grandmaster said, "Yes." I said, "He will come here tonight. This place is not unknown to him." "Yes. We expect him at approximately 2 in the morning. The window the security rotation creates is consistent, and he will use it." I put the wrench on the table. I said, "Tell me what you need me to do." What they needed was specific, and did not require explanation of how I came to have the information it required. They needed the associate rotation, the full rotation, both the decoy layer and the actual, and someone who could move through the estate's freight infrastructure without triggering the motion-indexed sensors that my father's security contractor had built, using a behavioral model calibrated to standard pattern threat profiles. The sensors were calibrated wrong. Not as a design flaw, as a deliberate limitation, because every sensor system is calibrated against something, and the something my father's contractor had used was the consortium's standard threat profile model, which was built on data from the Ilian transit security incidents of the previous decade, which were overwhelmingly perpetrated by a specific category of actor moving in specific patterns. The model was excellent at identifying that category. I was not that category. I was a cargo worker and a manifest supervisor who had spent 2 years moving in exactly the movement profile the model was designed to pass. Because I had been that profile before I was anything else, and the body retains what it was given early more reliably than the mind. I spent the afternoon briefing the Grandmaster's people on both layers of the rotation and on the sensor calibration parameters, as I understood them. They listened with the complete efficiency of people who are not performing comprehension, but actually achieving it, asking only what they actually needed, and not what demonstrated they were paying attention. There were 12 of them in the room. I had the impression of more. Elsewhere, the way you have the impression of current in water, even when the surface is still. The girl sat through the briefing in the corner by the wall. At one point, she crossed the room and stood beside me while I was sketching the rotation diagram, and she looked at it for a long time, and then she put her finger on a junction point in the east perimeter that I had not included in my sketch. I looked at the junction. I thought about it. There was a secondary sensor relay at that point. A relay I had omitted from the sketch, because I had classified it as supporting infrastructure rather than security infrastructure, which was correct from one angle and completely wrong from another. From the angle that mattered for what we were planning, it was part of the security infrastructure. And if the Grandmaster's people passed through that junction without accounting for the relay would complete a circuit that would tell my father's system that the east perimeter had been breached. In a way that the system should not have been able to see, she had understood the diagram and the problem, and the specific operational consequence of my omission faster than I had arrived at the same understanding. And she had communicated all of that with one finger on one point on a sketch, without a word. I marked the junction. My father came at 2 in the morning, which was the window I had predicted and the window he used. He came with 23 associates. I had given the Grandmaster an estimate of 18, which was the full complement, minus the 5 he typically held in reserve for facility security. 23 meant no reserve. T3 meant he was afraid, and afraid people use everything they have because they have stopped calculating returns. They came in 6 vehicles, which was more vehicles than 23 people required for transport, which meant the additional vehicles were for extraction, for taking something away. The girl, possibly me, depending on what calculation he had made about my operational value and my rehabilitability. The Grandmaster's people moved through the perimeter at the junction points I had marked, and did not trigger the center ratio and were inside the collectors for fish before the collectors. Formation understood. It had an inside. The difference between a formation that knows it has been penetrated and one that is discovering it in real time is approximately 3 seconds of operational capacity, which is more than enough if you know what you are doing with 3 seconds. I was in the freight corridor of the old theater house with the wrench and the magnetic tool and the comprehensive spatial memory of every load-bearing junction in the building's main structure, which I had spent the previous 2 hours confirming by moving through the building in the pattern of someone who is memorizing a space for professional rather than theatrical reasons. My father sent 3 associates through the back access while the main engagement was happening in the grounds outside. This was the right tactical decision given his information. His information did not include the fact that the freight corridor was occupied. Foxmass came through first. Talk him in the north corridor with a technique that Sergeant Instructor Voss had not explicitly taught, that I had developed across 2 years on the Ilion, run through the specific combination of the things Voss had taught and the things the Ilion run had added. The technique involved knowledge of what the freight corridor floor was made of. Poured composite, slightly yielding, excellent for a certain kind of leverage. And the specific load-bearing properties of a wrench handle applied at the correct angle to a knee joint from behind. He was down and would stay down for sufficient time. The other 2 came through the kitchen access. I was already in the kitchen corridor, and 2 of the Grandmaster's people were with me, having come from the south access, with the unhurried precision of people who had been exactly where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. Outside, the main engagement concluded over approximately 40 minutes. I did not witness it directly, and am not going to reconstruct it from implication, because I promised precision, and 40 minutes of engagement that I heard through stone walls does not produce precise data. What I can say is that my father's collectors were disarmed and contained, and my father himself was in the main room of the old theater house by 3:15 in the morning, seated in a chair, and the Grand Master was standing before him. My father looked at me once, across the room. His expression was one I had seen before. The specific face he made, when a variable in a model had performed outside its predicted range, and the model therefore required revision. He was not broken. He was not defeated in the emotional sense, he was updating. The update was costly, I could see that. But he was not a man who responded to cost by refusing to calculate. It was almost, in that moment, a form of respect I could have for him, the stubborn persistence of a rationalist, even when the rationalism has produced a catastrophic result. Master spoke to him for a long time. I heard enough of it. The cult of the collectors was over. The salon would not meet again. The associates would be dispersed. The laboratory would be decommissioned, and its records transferred to a custody I did not have the clearance to know the nature of. My father would live. The Grand Master said this with the flatness of someone reading a condition from a document rather than granting a mercy. Because it was a condition rather than a mercy. But the project was over and would not be resumed under any restructuring or rebranding. My father said, "You are setting back the science by decades." The Grand Master said, "The science is not yours." My father said, "Someone will use her. If not me, someone else, someone worse, someone with no protocols on, no ethics committee, and no 12 years of careful documented methodology. The waste will be," the Grand Master said, "the species will get there eventually." He did not say anything further on the topic. The silence that followed had a quality I can only describe as geological. Not crushing, not aggressive. Simply the quality of something that has been here longer than the argument being made against it, and will be here after the argument is over. They took my father out before dawn, with the disarmed associates, to wherever the Grand Master's people took such things. I did not ask. I stayed in the main room of the old theater house, with the two of the Grand Master's people who remained, and the girl, and the curtained stage at the far end of the room. I sat down on the floor because I was tired, and the floor was available, and there was nowhere else particularly correct to sit. The girl came across the room and sat down beside me. Not claiming proximity, not requesting comfort, but beside me in the way that people who have been through a thing together sit when the thing is finished and the adrenaline has settled, and the body is remembering that it is a body with ordinary needs. The room was quiet. The Grand Master's two people were at the entry and at the window, present and unobtrusive in the way of people performing security at the tail end of an event when the threat level has dropped to nominal. Outside, the first quality of gray, that is the preliminary of dawn, was beginning to establish itself in the gap under the door. I asked her, not expecting an answer, not even directing the question precisely at her rather than at the general situation, what she thought came next. She looked at the curtained stage at the far end of the room. Just looked at it, with the complete focused attention she gave to things that mattered. I looked at it too. I got up. I was tired, and my knee hurt from the freight corridor floor, and I was cold in the way that the body is cold after a long night of sustained adrenaline and inadequate shelter. I walked to the curtain and I took its edge and pulled. Behind it was a door, set into the wall, which should not have been possible from the structural plan I had spent 2 hours committing to memory. The theater house did not extend past that wall in any architectural logic I could apply. The door was old enough that its wood had darkened all the way through, and its hardware was the kind that predates current generation manufacture, and it was unlocked. Beyond it, darkness. Not the darkness of an unlit room. The darkness of space of some considerable and indeterminate size, with a quality of air that was not the air inside the theater house. I found a work lamp from the props cache beside the stage. I went through the door. It opened onto a beach. I want to be precise about this, because the instinct to make it more than it was is very strong, and the temptation toward spectacle is always most powerful when something is genuinely extraordinary. There was a beach, gray water with a long, low swell, gray sky with a line of pale color along the horizon, pale sand that was cold under my shoes, the smell of an ocean in the early hours, salt and old kelp, and the specific cold that open water generates when the air temperature is just above its dew point. There was a horizon that went as far as the eye had range to go. Whether the beach was on this continent, this hemisphere, this version of the physical world, my father had always described to me as straightforwardly Euclidean and available to be owned. I do not know. I have not been able to determine it since, and I made peace with not determining it sometime in the second year after. The door was where it was, and the beach was where it was, and the geography between them was a question that geography could not answer. The girl came through the door behind me. She stopped in the sand. She stood with the dry cloth still around her shoulders and her bare feet on the cold sand, and she looked at the sky. The sun was not yet up. The horizon was light in the particular way that precedes the sun's arrival. Not reflection, not glow, but the preliminary condition, the sky-making room. Gray to gray-pink to a pale warm color that does not a single common name, but that everyone knows, because everyone who has ever been awake early enough has seen it. She stood in it and watched it. I stood beside her, not between her and the light, beside her, which is the only correct position. I was cold and tired, and my hands had the particular heaviness that follows sustained physical work, and I was thinking about the freight corridor junction at 14, and Sergeant Instructor Voss, and the alien run, and on my father's face, when the Grand Master said, "The science is not yours," and underneath all of it I was thinking about what the Grand Master had said about what she wanted, that she wanted to see what came next. I had been turning that over for hours, and I had not finished with it. The sun came over the water's edge the way it always does. You wait and wait in the gray, and then it simply happens. The geometry of the planet completing itself in a few seconds of burning orange on the water, and then daylight, full and cold and total. She turned her face into it directly. She did not close her eyes. She turned her face the way you turn a plant toward what it needs, with the simple certainty of an organism that knows its requirements. I could feel the warmth coming off her after a time. Standing beside her in the cold, I could feel that she was generating heat. Not body heat in the ordinary metabolic sense, but something more. The warmth of a system that has been given what it was designed for and is now operating at capacity. She reached out and took my hand. Not claiming, not grateful in the transactional sense. It was more like a statement of coordinate. I am here, you are here. This is where we are, together, in this light. We stood until the sun was fully above the water and the gray was gone. The ocean had taken on its own color, which was a deep blue-green that was not the color of the Channel or the Mediterranean, or any specific body of water I could identify. Neither of us moved. I was cold, she was warm, and neither of those facts required action. I thought about my father's project. 12 years. 12 years of careful documentation and consortium meetings and blood. Taken, in precise measured quantities, from a girl who said nothing. 12 years of the species as the justification for everything, and the girl as the evidence, and those two things as the thing my father could not close, because he had never once asked the question that would have told him. The gap was the whole point. What does she want? The answer was not complex. The answers was the same thing any person wants when they have been kept a long time in a place they did not choose, to walk out of it, stand in light. To see what the horizon looks like from outside a controlled environment. To have someone stand beside them rather than above them or below them, or at a distance with an instrument and a clipboard. The Grand Master had called her a demonstration, a proof. He had meant something technical and correct by that, and I did not dispute the technical accuracy. Standing on the beach with her hand in mine and the sun on both our faces, the word that came to me was not demonstration or proof or prototype or resource. The word was person. A person who had been kept from sunlight, a person who had taken the hand of the first human being, who had moved toward her rather than away, on a cold street in the dark hours, and had followed where he led because the direction was out and out, was what she had been waiting for. Person who had put her finger on a junction point, on a diagram, because she had understood the diagram faster than I had, and because the mission required accuracy and she was a participant in the mission, not an object of it. Person who was warm in the morning on a beach, with the ocean making its patient sound behind us, watching what came next. The Grand Master had asked me, on the morning outside the compound gate, whether I knew what she was for. I had told him I knew what I had done, not what she was for, because that was the true and precise answer at the time. Standing on the beach, I understood the answer to his question more clearly, though I am still not certain I could defend it under examination. She was for this. For the direction the species was moving in, the direction that could not be taken by shortcut, or extracted in a laboratory, or purchased by the wealthy for the benefit of their consortium. The thing that happens when a person who has been kept in the dark long enough steps into light, not just the physical warmth of it, but the epistemological warmth, the expansion of what is known to be possible. She was demonstrating that the distance between what we are and what we are becoming is not a gulf that requires a bridge to be built by the powerful, using the resources of the powerless. It is a direction, it is a walk. And what the walk requires is not extraction or ownership or 12 years of controlled conditions. It requires someone to take your hand and say, "We are leaving." She let go of my hand after a while and walked a few steps toward the water, which was the right thing. And I let her go because letting her go was also the right thing. And I had been learning, across that long night, the specific geometry of when to hold and when to release. I stood on the cold sand with the wrench still in my belt, and the morning on my face and the sound of the water, and I thought about what came next for me, which was less clear than what came next for her, or for the species, or for the direction the Grandmaster had described. I was a cargo worker, and a manifest supervisor, and a man who had spent a night using a freight corridor and a maintenance tool, and a 40-minute memory from age 14 to break a girl out of a laboratory. I was not a prototype. I was not ahead of anything. I was the variable that had not been in my father's model. Not because I was exceptional. I want to be precise about this, finally, because it is the thing I most want to be precise about. Not because I was exceptional, because I had moved toward the person on the ground. Because I had asked the question with relevant operational status. Because when someone put their hand in mine on a cold tile floor and I had the option to lead somewhere, I led somewhere. And the somewhere I led to turned out to be this beach in this light. That was what the model had not accounted for. Not a hero, not a soldier, not a prototype or a proof. The cargo worker who remembered the junction. The son who asked the question. The human who moved toward the person on the ground. Because that is the most ordinary reflex a human being has. And it turned out to be exactly what was needed. She stood at the water's edge with her bare feet in the wet sand. And her face turned up to the sun, and the light caught her. And she was none of the things my father had called her, and none of the things the Grand Master had called her, and none of the things the 12 years of documentation had recorded. She was a person in the morning on a beach, seeing what came next. I knew what I knew, standing there. The load-bearing properties of a wrench, the rotation cycle of a security system, the way a wound looks when the blood has stopped, and the way a person looks when they have finally been given what they needed. That last one is not a complicated thing to know. It looks like someone standing in the sun with their eyes open, making no effort to look like anything at all. The rest is what the species does with the direction. The species will take its time. The direction will hold. It always has.